Two 349-person jets race in Delhi's twilight skies. 5 pilots prepare to land in one plane. The other shows 3 pilots climbing their departure path. A tower-top air traffic controller watches 2 blips on his screen move closer. These have what in common? The people in control of the outcome sit at the sharp ends of these structures and are supported by a large and complicated infrastructure. The aviation safety pyramid on which pilots and air traffic controllers perch is built on various technologies and infrastructures. The shocking result of defective pyramid foundations is going to be shown. On the evening of November 12, 1996, 289 passengers and 23 personnel boarded a Saudi Arabian Airlines Boeing 747 in Delhi. They traveled 4 hours to Saudi Arabia's Dhahran International Airport. Migrant workers for Gulf construction and hospitality jobs were among the passengers. They began a lengthy journey on Flight 763. Another party was descending into Delhi, preparing for a shorter trip, a few hundred kilometers northwest of where they sat. Most of the 27 passengers aboard Kazakh Flight 1907 were traders going to Delhi to shop. They planned to buy as many cheap textiles as possible and fill the plane with them for the return trip to Kazakhstan a few days later. For inexplicable reasons, which we'll discuss later, these 2 groups of passengers would draw closer than planned. At first, everything was routine when the Kazakh plane descended and the Saudi plane loaded with passengers and luggage. Captain Khalid al-Shubaili, 45, led Saudi Flight 763. He was a skilled pilot with about 10,000 hours of flight. He was familiar with Delhi's airspace from flying this trip numerous times. The flight's first officer, American Captain Nazir Khan, sat to his right. The 44-year-old pilot has over 7,000 hours of experience. Flight engineer Ahmed Idris backed the pilots. This flight crew's least experienced member was 33 years old and had just over 3,000 hours of experience. 3 pilots and 309 passengers and staff would be victimized by a complicated web of systemic deficiencies beyond their control this evening. For years, the pyramid's foundations had protected them from the heavens, but they were ready to collapse. Flight 763 left the gate after the pilots finished their checklists and all passengers boarded. The countdown to tragedy began. That evening, it was 20:06. Kazakh Flight 1907 descended, approaching the airport as the Saudi jet pushed back. It was 19 nautical miles, 170 kilometers distant. The ship had 27 passengers and 10 crew. Despite being only 4 years old, the Ilyushin Il-76's technology was outdated. 5 of this flight's 10 crew were in the cockpit. To fit everyone, the cockpit had 2 decks, upper and lower. Captain Alexander Robertovich Cherepanov, 44, sat in the left seat on the upper deck. First Officer Ermek Kuzumbetovich Zangirov, 37, was to his right. Behind him were 50-year-old flight engineer Alexander Alexandrovich Chuprov and 41-year-old radio operator Igor Alexeyevich Repin. Finally, 51-year-old navigator Janibek Jusupovich Apriev sat in an original glass cockpit on the lower deck. Experienced team. Even the first officer, the least experienced pilot, had nearly 7,000 cockpit hours. This, together with some aircraft idiosyncrasies, would have disastrous effects as the plane approached Delhi. The controller lowered Flight 1907 to 18,000 feet at 33:06. The captain ordered him to handle all ATC communications during the approach and landing in Delhi. The method was unusual. Every flight into and out of Delhi took a unique route. Military and civilian sovereignty of Indian airspace was split 50-50 in 1996. Civilian aircraft were barred from military airspace and military aircraft from civilian airspace. This division hit Delhi's airport hard. The airport was just turned over to civilians a year earlier, and the military still controlled much of the airspace. Civilian aircraft could only enter and exit the airport through a limited channel. This ran from the airport to Lungkar, 330 kilometers west. Kazakh Flight 1907 was entering Delhi using this corridor. Saudi Flight 763 left the airport using this corridor. You're not alone in thinking leaving and arriving planes should not fly the same path. Controllers in Delhi had protested this system for years without success. We'll see the results soon. The Saudi pilots lined up their enormous 747 with runway 28 and began their takeoff roll at 33 minutes past 6, just as the Kazakh pilots gained descent clearance. Soon after, they and their 309 passengers and staff were flying over Delhi's thick population. Today was wonderful for flying. The winds were quiet, and while there was some haze below, visibility was much better above. Flight 763 had first contact with Delhi approach control after departure, the VK controller. Dutta oversaw all airport arrivals and departures. He commanded the Saudi aircraft to rise to 10,000 feet after seeing them on his radar. Like Kazakh jet pilots, Dutta worked using outdated technologies. His radar wasn't modern since the 1960s. Instead of receiving electronic data from the aircraft, a radar dish at the airport sent out a signal in all directions and picked it up when it was reflected off an aircraft. Because of this, it could only tell planes' positions, not altitudes or types. When given this information, Dutta relied on the pilots. A sophisticated radar system had been planned for almost a decade, but bureaucracy prevented its implementation. One man sat atop this antiquated infrastructure, separating passenger planes at an airport with 4-minute takeoffs and landings. One man had to work with one piece of information per plane in one tight corridor because the airport had one entrance and exit. Only by keeping planes at different heights could the controller keep them apart. The controller wanted to keep the approaching Kazakh plane high and let the Saudi plane pass underneath. As the Saudi 747 climbed to 10,000 feet, the Kazakh airliner descended 23,000 feet to 18,000. The radio operator behind the pilots informed air traffic control of their location. The controller ordered the flight to descend to 15,000 feet and report back. The radio operator acknowledged this, and the plane descended. Since both planes were tuned to the same radio frequency, their pilots could hear each other's communications and air traffic control conversations. Pilots maintain situational awareness by listening to other planes to understand the airspace. In crowded airport airspace, this protects planes. In the Kazakh plane's cockpit, the radio operator and pilots were talking. The controller gave them 15,000 feet, which they had to translate to meters. Because most cockpit altimeters, including the first officer's, indicated altitude in meters. This was crucial since he flew the plane. Only the captain's and navigator's lower deck altimeters showed feet. The radio operator reviewed his conversion chart and told the pilots that 15,000 feet equaled 4,570 meters. 1 minute after the controller cleared the Kazakh flight to 15,000 feet, the Saudi Arabian pilots reported being level at 10,000 feet, asking the controller for more height. The controller cleared Saudi Flight 763 to 14,000 feet. Here was the closest the controller would let the planes get. He would wait for the Saudi plane to pass 1,000 feet below the Kazakh plane before giving rising and descending orders. The Kazakh flight radio operator asked the navigator to validate his feet-to-meter conversion just to be sure. Despite being the only person on the Kazakh plane in direct communication with air traffic control, the radio operator had no altimeter. He had to uncomfortably lean over to one side to check the pilot's instruments to see his plane's height. The two planes were now minutes from meeting in the skies. The Kazakh plane descended while the Saudi plane climbed. On time, the Saudi pilots called air traffic control to report nearing 14,000 feet. The controller advised them to stay put when they requested more altitude. He would maintain them at 14,000 until the Kazakh plane passed 1,000 feet overhead. All was okay on Saudi Flight 763. The pilots knew about the arriving plane but were unconcerned. They had flown in and out of Delhi many times without problems with other aircraft. As instructed, they leveled off at 14,000 feet in a few moments. The passengers in the back of the plane were unaware that another aircraft was approaching them at high speed behind a black cloud a few miles ahead. In the next few seconds, a series of events would shock aviation and raise significant questions about Indian airspace safety. The controller requested Kazakh Flight 1907's airport position. They reached 15,000 feet and were 46 nautical miles from the airport, according to the radio operator. Strangely, the plane was 46 miles from the airport, but not at 15,000 feet, as the radio operator indicated. Instead, the airliner was dropping 16,400 feet. It would take another minute to reach 15,000. Why did the radio operator notify the controller they hit 15,000? The cause of this odd transmission may explain what happened later. It was likely simple. The radio operator didn't have an altimeter. He probably couldn't see the pilot's altimeters, so he assumed they'd leveled off at 15,000. This broadcast suggests poor crew communication, not that the radio operator miscalculated the plane's height. The flight crew was fundamentally at odds. The controller advised the Kazakh flight to stay at 15,000 and cautioned that a Saudi Boeing 747 at 12 o'clock, 10 miles away, would intersect them in 5 miles. In the forward cockpit, the two pilots chatted while searching for the Saudi plane. On a clear night, they could have seen the 747's lights through their windscreens. However, dense clouds blocked their view of the other plane. The radio operator asked the controller to repeat his jet's distance from the Saudi plane. Officer, traffic is at 8 miles, level 140. The radio operator said his team was searching for the second plane. Things got worse here. As the crew searched for the 747 ahead, they descended below their cleared altitude of 15,000 feet. After descending slowly, the Kazakh airliner entered a cloud. Both airplanes were in the same cloud, speeding toward each other at almost 1,000 kilometers per hour. Why the Kazakh jet fell below its cleared height is unknown. Due to their poor English, the pilots may have misinterpreted the controller's report of traffic at 14,000 feet as clearance to drop to 14,000 feet. With his Soviet altimeter, the first officer may not have heard the radio operator and navigator convert feet and meters earlier. Perhaps he knew to level off at 15,000 feet, but not in meters. However, if these planes had TCAS, or Traffic Collision Avoidance System, which was necessary in the US at the time, they would have detected the risk instantly. At fewer than 40 seconds before impact, the technology would have frantically ordered the pilots to climb away. This last line of protection was not mandatory in India or anywhere else outside the US. In the control tower, VK Dota, the last line of defense, had no means of knowing that one of his screen blips was not responding to his commands. He stared blissfully as the two blips grew closer. The Saudi pilots had overheard the conversation that the controller was having with the Kazakh pilots, and they too were blissfully unaware of the fact that the Kazakh plane was not leveled at 15,000 feet, as it had claimed. At the same time that the two planes were screaming their way toward one another through the cloud, the seconds were counting down. The radio operator yelled out, "Hold the level!" at a startling moment, which occurred at 6:39 p.m. and 57 seconds. There was a good chance that he had observed the altimeters of the pilots, indicating that they had got too low. There was now a distance of 18 seconds between the two aircraft. "Maintain!" was called out by the flight engineer, and the radio operator echoed this by saying, "Keep to level 150 to provide further clarification. Keep from going down." After a long time, the captain came to the realization that he had committed a terrible error. After disconnecting the autopilot, he gave the first officer the command to boost the power generated by the engine. At the same time that the engines were roaring to high power, the radio operator yelled out, "Get to 150 because on the 140, that one." The lights of the 747 were visible to every member of the crew, and they filled their windscreens. It was, however, too late. The left wing of the Kazakh plane collided with the left engines of the Boeing, which resulted in a significant explosion. Both aircraft continued to move forward for a few hundred meters before crashing into the ground and engulfing themselves in their flames as they fell to the ground. Shortly after that, he became aware of a voice in Arabic that was broadcast on the radio. That aircraft was the Saudi one. Despite his repeated attempts, he was unable to get a response from either of the aircraft. Each of the planes crashed into the ground exactly 1 minute after they had collided. Those who survived were not found. Even though it resulted in the deaths of 349 people, this incident continues to be the third worst aviation accident in history and the deadliest mid-air collision in history. As soon as the disaster occurred, several parties immediately began attempting to assign blame to the many individuals who were involved. The final report on the incident highlights the significant role that the Kazakh pilots played, as they were the ones who had fallen below their assigned altitude. This is a point that is emphasized throughout the study. It became quite easy for a working culture to evolve in which certain activities were considered as not my problem. This was due to the sheer number of personnel that were present in the cockpit. In this particular instance, no member of the crew took responsibility for ensuring that the aircraft maintained the height that was given to it. It was not helpful that the electronics that were on board the Kazakh plane were almost as old as the airplane itself. Not only did the aircraft lack TCAS, but it also lacked an altitude alarm tone, which was something that every Western passenger aircraft had been equipped with since the 1960s. If this had been done, the pilots would have been notified when they were getting close to their designated height. In addition to this, the autopilot of the aircraft did not even have an altitude capture mode, which meant that it was unable to automatically level out when the desired altitude was attained. These are extremely fundamental autopilot functions, which have been present in other aircraft for decades before this project. All of these factors, when paired with the architecture of the airspace that was badly inadequate and out of date, ensured that this tragedy would almost certainly occur. As a direct consequence of this tragedy, India achieved the distinction of becoming the second nation in the world to mandate the utilization of TCAS within its airspace in the year 1999. It wasn't long before other countries followed suit, and now it's prevalent throughout the world. Moreover, the airport in Delhi, as well as the airspace in India in general, was finally given the renovation that it had been so urgently in need of. Modern radar systems have been installed at all of the country's main airports, and the airspace that surrounds these airports has been largely transferred to civilian management. There are currently as many as 500,000 people in India who are able to safely take to the skies on a daily basis, and this number is increasing from year to year. In the end, the tragedy was triggered by the chaos and uncertainty that existed within the Kazakh cockpit. However, the insufficient infrastructure and antiquated technology were the factors that ultimately determined the destiny of all 349 individuals who were aboard the two planes. This wake-up call came at the expense of a great number of lives, which is a tragic circumstance. If you enjoyed this content and found it informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us create more engaging and insightful content.